Okay, so this is my podcast going over blacksmithing, and I have a small group here as my uh, podcastees. I don't know. Uh,
Hello.
Daniel,
Yeah.
there's
Hi.
Daniel. That's Daniel. Uh, Chris,
Bonjour.
Maddox,
Hello.
and I am Cody. So let's get this started. Um, well, I'll just introduce blacksmithing, I guess, since what does everybody know about blacksmithing here? Like just general idea, so I know how much we know about it.
I know it's a good workout, and that's about it for my knowledge.
Um, I know relative techniques, I guess, and stuff, but that's about it. I don't know too much about it.
I I know that there are several techniques and several ways to do blacksmithing, as well as some very useful techniques that are skill based.
Okay, cool, cool. So I got a baseline. Um, Metalsmithing is the overarching portion of blacksmithing. Metalsmithing specifically is uh, forging and working with any type of metal, which is more often found nowadays in jewelry because most people don't do like small scale blacksmithing. And blacksmithing of the past has kind of turned more into industrial blacksmithing, like large factories for like cars and such. Blacksmithing specifically is working with metals like steel or iron.
Okay. I never know that difference. That's pretty interesting.
hmm let's see. Metalsmithing also includes, in the past, included copper, bronze, literally any metal, and uh, it just was how metal smithing began and how blacksmithing was brought to today. As
Okay.
as for the history, metalsmithing is the overarching, but blacksmithing in the past was more weapons, armor. It wasn't really like tools, or there were some tools, but most often blacksmithing was used in times of war, as tools were more often made out of weaker metals, not like copper, but some
Tin,
bronze.
Iron, bronze,
tin was
Yeah,
pretty popular, if I recall.
tin was for like cookware in the past, and it still kind of
Oh.
is. But yeah, blacksmithing more recently, or I say recently, but in the United States, the American Blacksmithing Artists Association, I said that wrong, but was founded in the early 1900s here in the United States.
Oh. It's got history. Got history.
Yes, it does have history, especially because it originated in Oklahoma.
Hmm. Any info on its founder?
It wasn't a single founder. The uh, Artist Blacksmith Association is what I'll go with for now. Was founded by blacksmiths all across America. Before they were just independent and mostly didn't work together or to help further blacksmithing. But once the association was founded, they worked together. They made basically they taught other people how to blacksmith. They basically became their own school of blacksmithing.
cool.
So it became a collaboration between multiple artists in the blacksmithing field. Pretty
Yes.
cool.
hmm I remember correctly, there was over 30 founders, with air quotes, at that association.
Did you?
Oh,
And how large is it today?
Today it is one of, if not the only, proprietors of blacksmithing, both hobbyist and business, in the United States, in that they do their own teaching, their own schooling. Uh, hmm?
Do they have a
What's that?
dedicated building to teach people at?
Yes, I believe it is in Oklahoma. I might be mistaken though.
Okay. It's pretty darn
Um,
interesting.
yeah, and going back to blacksmithing in a little more in the past, from going from weapons, blacksmiths started working more with tools like the rims and wheels of carts were almost always lined with metal, as well as one of the most common things that blacksmiths did was horseshoes. They would fix,
Horseshoes.
make, and uh, disperse horseshoes. Yeah.
Do you know how many horseshoes they would make?
I mean, in on a general sense, blacksmiths were the only ones that made horseshoes. Like nobody else really could make horseshoes other than blacksmiths. So the general sense is
Yeah,
all of
it was
them.
a bit of a monopoly, wasn't it?
It was a monopoly, but this was also before the Artist Association, so it became a monopoly for each blacksmith in their area because there was rarely
I feel
more
like
than
it,
one or two blacksmiths in an area or a state even.
I feel like it became a monopoly that was also incredibly tedious because most of the people who used horses were either incredibly wealthy or were in the military.
Yes, for a large, yeah, for a large
Horses were a
person.
symbol of status.
Exactly. Yeah.
So even the rich and powerful still respected the blacksmith.
Well, respect isn't quite the right
Yeah,
term. Uh, they gave about as much respect as any other small business might get from the extremely wealthy, which is not much.
Because
Oh,
I mean, they weren't really. It was just horseshoes, so it's not like they really noticed a difference. It was kind of
Hmm.
something that helped the horse survive,
if and they couldn't
and
really go
run
on
better.
strike because there weren't exactly laws that prevented people from being killed for not listening.
Exactly. Oh my goodness.
actually, the Magna Carta. Hmm, sorry, sorry, that was on me. That only
When
applies
was
to
Hold on,
king.
actually, when was that made again?
I believe 1421 or 1621.
And after uh, the horseshoes and the carriage wheels and those type of tools, it evolved again into it kind of diverged into two main paths.
Oh,
Generally,
okay.
yeah. Hmm.
I figured
Go
out
ahead.
the thing about the Magna Carta. You
Yes.
keep going on with your thing. I'll list my thing once you're done.
Well, we're going to be moving on to a different portion, so go ahead. Bringing
Okay.
more
So
into
the
the
Magna
future.
Carta was signed June 15th, 1215, but 10 weeks after it was signed, Pope Innocent III nullified it,
Hmm.
Politics.
which plunged England into civil war.
That almost feels like a more
Because it was
interesting tangent.
nullified, the blacksmiths were not respected and they were threatened with uh, death.
Yep.
Yes.
In fact, it was King. I forget which king, but it's the one king did too bad and
King
all.
John.
King John, the one and only. Because no one wanted his name again after that.
There's so many Johns.
Yeah,
Well,
there
he
really
is the
is.
only King John in the British royal family because he screwed up so bad no one else wanted to take his name.
Very interesting tangent. Almost more interesting, but we'll keep going. Uh, after
We get
all of
sidetracked a lot.
yes, we do.
It's
We
okay.
should focus more.
Keep going. keep going, Junior. This is about your blacksmithing. I'm more interested in hearing what happens next in the divergence you were just about to talk about.
Okay, yeah. I Blacksmithing after that kind of diverted. For the most part, most of it went into industrial. Like when the Industrial Revolution came around, blacksmiths, once it got into metalworking, turned to factories. And for the most part, slowly, blacksmiths started going more into large scale production, and fewer small businesses stayed as blacksmiths.
Okay.
However, there were
I mean,
those now and in the past that stayed as these small business blacksmiths, and some of them didn't even do them as businesses. Some of them did it as a hobby now instead of a job.
So blacksmithing became profitable enough to run as a side hobby.
Yeah. Hmm.
well, it was more, I think, was it profitable though, or was it more of just like either save money maybe on the side, or for like just for fun?
It's mostly a bit of both, but since small scale hobbying or blacksmithing, sorry, became so uncommon, and most of it went to industrial. These smaller hobbyists did actually were actually able to make a good bit more money because basically became a not a it definitely was not a monopoly, but it was more like either a local small business or a global big business. What would you rather choose, the global business or the probably slightly
Oligopoly?
hmm?
Oligopoly? Where
Globally?
it's multiple
Oh,
businesses that are capable of that are all somewhat reliant on each other.
well, mm, I'll use fencing companies actually as an example. With large scale fencing companies, like you could get nice wrought iron fences, but if part of it was broke after a long time, large scale companies would want to replace a large portion of the fence. But a more hobbyist small business blacksmith could fix the one part that was broke for you for usually cheaper and faster. Or maybe
To
not
put it
faster.
simply, to put it simply, the hobbyists work on a smaller scale of production, while the large companies work on large factors of production. So it depends on how much product you want and at what scale.
Exactly.
Basically, small businesses would fix anything that the big businesses items like broke, and they were just the big businesses obviously aren't going to be working on some small broken thing on your fence while there's just no reason for them to.
Yeah,
While
it's
they
it's
basically
not
a small
profitable.
business can do all those small tedious things.
Exactly.
Scale of production. International business was a good class.
Yeah, and then there was some in between where you might get multiple blacksmiths that work together to form like slightly larger businesses. But they more relied on those small jobs. And of course, there would always be that small group that just did blacksmithing for the fun of it.
Yeah.
Hmm. But
Okay.
the two main
So
groups
what's
were industrial and uh, small business, I guess we could go with.
what's next on the timeline?
Next would be the industrial became more industrial, like cars. Something that some of us can relate to a little more, like irrigation,
If
irrigation
before
pipes.
so before we move on to that, a skill that was developed by blacksmiths during the section that we're on currently.
Hmm.
Uh, it's it's a technique that was created to make it so that blacksmithing would be faster, so that you wouldn't have to spend more time heating up the metal, and it involved having a steady hand
Hmm.
because you would hit the metal repeatedly with a hammer so quickly that it would so quickly with enough force that it would actually start to reheat the metal.
The kinetic force transferring into thermal energy, such loosening the bonds between the atoms.
Yes.
Hmm. Uh, that actually is
Do
a
continue.
yeah, that's actually a good segue because next I can go on to the tools that small businesses use. Obviously, large scale businesses, as they progressed, started using bigger machines to do all the work instead of the people themselves. In the very beginning of large businesses, they obviously still had the blacksmiths do it mostly themselves, but once they got bigger, they started having machines do it, like more nowadays, where they mass produce things like cars and computer cases and just larger products. But these smaller businesses, they use the tools of like that have been used throughout history: a hammer, an anvil, a forge, and all these things can come in different types. Like for the hammer, there are flat hammers, there are ball peen hammers, which have a rounded head to expand the metal because the rounded part would push metal away from where it was hit.
Okay, that's pretty interesting there.
Yeah. Uh, and then there are different type of anvils, and then there are even machine hammers called power hammers, which are just machines that lift a large chunk of metal up and then just let it drop onto whatever you are hammering, and it will just for you. So
Potential,
yeah. Mhm.
potential energy into kinetic.
Mhm. Exactly. And then there's different type of forges. There were larger forges. There's open top forges. It really just depends on what you're trying to make. Smaller forges are good for smaller items, and open air forges are also better for smaller items. But if you're trying to make something large, like some hobbyist blacksmiths will work with other hobbyists that in different areas to make like old medieval swords even. And so a more enclosed forge is much better for forging weapons like they did in the past.
I have a question.
Yes.
How did
What is your question, soldier?
how did
Don't
welding
respond to that, please.
how did welding affect blacksmithing?
Yeah, welding uh before welding, I guess we'll start there. You had to make your own and even now, but it was more common back then. You would have to make tools yourself that could hold the metal but wouldn't heat up like your hand while you're holding it in the forge. Now with welding, what many blacksmiths, especially hobbyist blacksmiths, obviously, will do is they will weld on a piece of uh, another piece of metal that they're not actually trying to forge, and they will use that just as a handle instead of having entire other like another clip or another
Tool.
thing to another tool to hold it. You just weld a piece of metal to it. Usually rebar. They'd usually use rebar for this.
Rebar. That's the stuff they put in concrete, if I recall.
Yes, it is. It's what they
Mhm.
use to put structure in
Big
concrete.
metal poles with spirals.
Hmm. It's like if you made a screw just without wanting it to be a screw.
Yeah, pretty much. And instead of like screwing it in, you just drop it in.
Yeah, exactly.
I've worked with rebarb. There's rebarb in the concrete steps that I made around our back front door.
It's very interesting. Rebar itself is actually very good at dispersing heat because it's just a rod, basically.
Yeah.
It's
And
minimum applying of the square cube wall.
yeah. Nowadays, just in general, most actual blacksmiths are hobbyist and small business, whereas the industrial ones kind of have become more technical workers that work with machines that do the forging and building of metals for them.
Hmm.
Of course, in the very large industrial scale with like cranes and stuff, where you need giant beams, you will have these massive smelteries that people will are technically blacksmiths there because they use machines to compress and shape the metal. They just move use like chains and stuff to move the metal around and conveyor belts and stuff like that.
Sounds interesting. Are we getting close to automation soon?
Well, that technically is automation. Is once they get out of the giant smelteries, they put it in a machine and it goes through different steps to say you have like basically just a solid bar of steel uh, that's like about as half as wide and about as tall as you want your beam to be. You would then compress the center of the steel, and out of the sides it would extend, and the machine would do this incrementally by pushing the metal through and then getting it slightly smaller and then bringing the metal back through in the smaller size. And of course, these machines were always heated, so the metal wouldn't just cool down while it's going through the machine. It'll stay heated so that the machine can keep doing this without it having to be brought back to some kind of forge.
That's pretty darn interesting.
Yes. And
Yes.
as a little tangent, but still part of the idea, is we're going to discuss the difference of metallurgy, which doesn't sound very different, and they do go hand in hand, but they are different practices. Metallurgy is where you take liquid metal instead of just heated metal and pour it into molds to make your uh, whatever piece you're trying to make instead of just bending it into shape. Metallurgy
I
is
also
you,
I
yeah,
have
mhm,
a model car that I'm working on that was the metal parts were made through metallurgy.
mhm,
And
yeah,
something with metallurgy is it'll have something called flash. Do you know what that is?
no,
no.
not really. I
Flash is the excess metal.
is that like where they would pour it from, where the metal is poured from?
No, it's
Mm.
where it would overflow and would seep
Oh,
out.
yes. Uh-huh. The There are different types of metallurgy where it's completely contained, which is how, oddly enough, that hobbyist metallurgists will do it, is they'll completely contain what they're casting, and then they will break it out once it is cooled. And metallurgy is the starting point of blacksmithing, because blacksmithing nowadays is almost solely with steel, and the only way to get steel is through metallurgy by mixing iron and carbon.
Fun fact, the first form of primitive steel was made by the Vikings, as their belief that using animal bones in the forging of swords and weapons would empower the weapon with the animal spirit. This actually made the weapon stronger, as the carbon from the bone would make a primitive steel.
Yes, that yeah, that is one thing that made the Vikings' weapons actually stronger. Was they're just made of a primitive steel.
I I love how everyone considers the Vikings to be incredibly brutal when in reality they were just good at it because everyone did it during that time.
Yeah,
Everyone did it, but the Vikings were better, so everyone hated them.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Metallurgy kind of goes down two different paths. Well, they both combine, but it can cut off and come back in. Metallurgy is really any metal, and you pour and cast, or it's the combining of metal and other elements or other metals, and then casting or just making into a bar that a blacksmith may use.
Hmm,
So they kind of go hand in
that's
hand.
very interesting.
Basically, what all this means is blacksmithing is the lifeblood of technology for a very long time. Only until recently, since computers kind of came out, or not came out, but became a mainstream use, blacksmithing was the heart of technology and advancement for quite a long time.
Yeah, it's crazy how like see what hold on. Did you list a specific year when it was built and I forgot or when
What,
it was this
the Artists Association?
no, when blacksmithing was invented.
No, there's not one date you can put down because it started in many different places, and it's kind of hard to tell exactly which one started it first because a
Similar to
lot of it.
agriculture.
Well,
Hmm.
all right. It, it says it began a millennia ago. Um,
That's plausible. I mean, we've been a
it's more
millennia.
than a millennia.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
is
Probably
more.
definitely.
we've pretty much been using at least some sort of blacksmith thing like ever since humans pretty much walked on this earth, just like a couple thousand years, I'm pretty sure, after something, isn't it?
Well, it was basically almost probably a
Just
few
building
hundred.
and then like
Yeah, a few hundred-ish years. Well, yeah, actually, with metal specifically, which was it is a type of metal. There is a type of metal just called metal that is it's very poor quality. But basically, they would, instead of heating it up to form it, way back in the past, like back right at the beginning of like farming and all that
stone
type of stuff.
tools.
Yeah, they would instead just use stone tools to form it into shape because it was a bit malleable and it could be cut into shape, kind of like flint. They and that was like the very beginning of metalsmithing in general. Blacksmithing
Kind of
is
glass-like metal.
yes,
I
uh-huh.
believe that metal is called tin. I might be wrong, but I believe it's tin.
I think
Well,
he said
technically,
it is called metal.
yeah, no, there is a metal called just metal, like that is its
Whoa.
name, and it's technically just a mix of multiple metals in one area that they just
Yeah,
never separated out, and thus
I've
that
got
was
a
the first
picture that
metal.
seems to be incredibly accurate. I'll send it to you.
I,
Fair enough.
I'm not going to add it to the podcast, but
Yeah, I know.
What's the next point we have?
well, we're getting here to the end because I've gone through the ages, I've gone through the tools. In the past, the forges were much larger and were basically like oversized ovens almost.
Probably near volcanoes.
Yeah. Hmm.
Near volcanoes or
Or with
nah, not hot springs. Not hot
or
enough
with
there.
areas that have large enough fauna or sorry vegetation sorry that could be used as fuel.
Yeah.
Obviously, coal and stuff wasn't really coal specifically wasn't really discovered until a bit later. They usually use charcoal, which is when you burn uh, carbon-based like fauna and burn it, it
It
will
leaves
leave
behind a charcoal.
yeah charcoal, which burns very slow and doesn't really produce a flame, but it still burns as hot.
Actually, it burns a little colder, which doesn't bring out as many impurities in the metal, but it does get hot enough for blacksmithing.
And technically, some claims have been made that with the use of charcoal, because technically it used to be carbon, some people believe that some tools in the past were infused with carbon because they used charcoal furnaces. Uh, it's still somewhat disputed, but it's mostly disproven, as usually what's burning out is carbon, and it is being vaporized instead of being infused in the metal because that usually only happens in the liquid metal.
You need to put some bones in that metal to make it strong.
Hmm.
Even metal needs calcium.
Oh, you know what that just, now I feel stupid.
Oh,
What?
That explains why there's so many bones in the Monster Hunter weapon crafting.
oh, yeah, that does make sense. That's a tangent
There's a
that's a
lot of
little.
science that's been put into that game.
There really has
Yeah,
been.
actually, yeah. Like they
Uh,
just didn't silly,
I'll be right
silly,
back.
but they actually sought it out, which is nice.
hmm Well,
Anyway, before we get sidetracked anymore,
I'm gonna wrap it up. Actually, that's about it. Yeah, that's the history of blacksmithing. Uh, you really got any questions about it? Because that's about where we're gonna
No
conclude.
questions, not at the immediate moment.
I got a little tidbit I want to say, but I'm only going to say it after the podcast has ended because
Okay. Well, yeah, that's basically everything about blacksmithing that there is to know, at least in general, broad strokes. I would love to get into more detail, but I'm pretty sure we all are relatively busy. So,
yeah.
hmm well, that was great time, gentlemen. So, guess we'll call it there.
Alright.
It's the podcast.